It changed. Yes, after the presentation we will sit down.
Yes. Okay, good.
Bé, molt bon dia a tothom, moltes gràcies per haver vingut. Hello, welcome. Avui estem aquí per la masterclass del senyor Robert Boynton. Les masterclass que fem al Col·legi de Periodistes formen part de la programació del Centre de Formació i Desenvolupament del Col·legi de Periodistes. Aquest centre va entrar en funcionament ara fa una mica més de 3 anys i fem regularment una programació de cursos, preferiblement cursos molt curts en diferents àmbits, adreçats a periodistes però també al públic en general perquè toquem un ventall molt ampli de temes. Fem webinars encara més curts, que són normalment d'una hora de durada, també oberts a tot el públic en general i que a més pel seu format estan pensats per ser seguits des de casa, i un cop cada trimestre programem una masterclass, que és el que avui ens ha reunit aquí. Per nosaltres avui poder tenir l'oportunitat de comptar amb en Robert Boynton és una ocasió molt especial. N'estem molt contents de tenir un ponent del seu nivell, de la seva experiència internacional. Probablement ho heu vist en la documentació de la convocatòria. Ell és periodista, és director del postgrau en periodisme de revistes de la New York University i és autor d'aquest llibre que es presenta justament després d'aquest acte, que es diu El Nuevo Periodismo. Del llibre ens en parlarà ara un moment en Roberto Herscher, que és el director de la col·lecció i que ha impulsat la traducció castellana d'aquest llibre, i també gràcies a ell és que tenim avui l'oportunitat de comptar amb nosaltres, amb en Robert Boynton. El tema de la masterclass no serà el nou periodisme, això també ja ho haureu llegit en la convocatòria, sinó que a partir de la seva experiència, del seu coneixement, del fet de viure en un entorn privilegiat com és la ciutat de Nova York i treballar en una de les seves universitats més prestigioses com és la New York University, ens parlarà de les revolucions que està experimentant el periodisme. És una mica la finalitat d'aquestes masterclass, és ajudar-nos a tots plegats, els que són periodistes i també els que no ho són, a situar-nos dintre d'aquestes transformacions que està experimentant el món en general i molt particularment el món de la comunicació. Ell enfocarà, això abans parlàvem, a partir de que vivim una revolució comparable a la revolució de Gutenberg, però prefereixo que sigui ell el qui expliqui els seus arguments i no avançar-me en el tema. Abans de començar, ja ho he dit, en Roberto Herscher, que li dono una vegada més les gràcies, ens situarà breument l'acte de després.
Sí. Moltíssimas gracias, Carlos. Seré muy breve. ¿Pero? Cerrado. Sí. Entonces seré más breve todavía. ¿Ahora sí? Muchísimas gracias por haber venido. Este es un proceso que llevó más de 2 años de traer aquí a Robert Boynton. Hablaremos de eso más en la presentación del libro. Esta es principalmente una invitación a que los que quieran se queden. A las 12:30, Carles Gelli, periodista de cultura del país y profesor de estas nuevas formas de hacer periodismo literario en la Universidad Ramon Llull, y yo lo presentaremos y dialogaremos con él en la presentación de este, que es el 6º libro ya de la colección Periodismo Activo. Llevamos 3 años haciendo libros de y sobre periodismo, y esta es la 2ª vez que presentamos un libro en esta sala. La última vez fue hace 1 año y medio, y tuvimos el enorme honor y privilegio, tanto Josep Cuní como Xavier Mas de Xaxàs y yo, de presentar el libro de entrevistas de Margarita Rivière lamentablemente fallecida hace un par de meses. Y entonces tomamos esta también como nuestra casa y la casa de los que hacemos, y sobre todo aquí están todos mis compañeros de publicaciones, de la oficina de publicaciones de la Universidad de Barcelona, que en tiempos duros y desde una editorial de una universidad pública, para mí es un enorme privilegio compartir con ellos la publicación de libros como este. Este es el más ambicioso de todos, es una traducción y es un libro muy importante, y los invito a todos a que se queden a la presentación del nuevo periodismo de Robert Boynton después de esta clase.
Muchas gràcies, Roberto. Per part meva res més. Jo crec que tots estem aquí per escoltar en Robert Boynton. Robert, it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here today, so we will take no more time from you. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm very privileged. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Roberto, for inviting me here. I'm always slightly embarrassed when I listen to introductions like this. It makes it sound as if I'm Moses coming down from the mount with tablets to explain the world. And I know that in this room there is enough experience and wisdom to educate me on these subjects far more than I could educate any of you. I'll make one quick personal comment, which is that I'm always happy when journalists from around the world who come through New York come to my office, come to have coffee or lunch with me, and talk about the state of journalism, state of literary journalism in their countries and in general. So please, any of you who come through New York, send me an email. It's robert.boynton@nyu.edu, and I would love to have lunch, coffee, or anything like that with you. So please take me up on that. So the news that there is a crisis in journalism is not exactly news to anyone in this room. The comments that I have, the thoughts I have about it, are really more along the lines of trying to think through the origins and what the origins of the crisis tell us about, or hope to tell us about the future, perhaps tell us about the future. So when I talk about the revolution in journalism, I often comment that it has changed as much in the past 25 years as it did in the 25 years after Gutenberg invented the printing press. It's sort of my way of trying to understand why journalism feels so confusing, so perpetually unfamiliar and out of control and chaotic. And it isn't only cynical veterans who feel this way. My students at New York University, the first of whom got their degrees in year 2000, when I started teaching, feel this way as well. And after I've been invoking Gutenberg for such a long time, I thought I should look into the details of his story more closely. I was surprised to find that there were not as many biographical facts about Gutenberg as I thought there would be. First of all, though, there is something. It turns out that he was more an assembler than a real inventor. The screw press, which applied direct pressure in a flat plane, was invented by the Romans in 1st century AD to make wine and oil. He wasn't the first person to even try to mechanize printing. In the 8th century, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans made books using engraved wooden blocks. In the 11th century, the Chinese even invented movable type. In the 12th century, Europe made text by reusing individual letters. Gutenberg's most important discovery was really a conceptual one, that typesetting and printing were two separate steps. Gutenberg had been a goldsmith before he became a printer and learned how to create an alloy of lead and tin that was very flexible and cooled very quickly. In addition, he invented a matrix to mold type quickly and precisely, and these were really the core aspects of his invention. Now, I think the economic problems that beset Gutenberg are also quite familiar and really modern in a way. Like many innovators in journalism in particular, today, Gutenberg wasn't very good at business. In 1450, he borrowed 800 guldens, which was about $150,000 in today's currency, from Johann Fust, and another 800 guldens in 1453 to expand his shop for the Bible project. When Gutenberg worked on the Bible, at the same time he printed up much more lucrative jobs like Latin grammars and indulgences, of course, from the Catholic Church. And finally, in 1456, Gutenberg produced the Bible. Unfortunately, that was the same year that Fust demanded his money back. Fust went to court, sued, and won control over Gutenberg's printing workshop and half of the Bibles he had already printed. This left Gutenberg nearly bankrupt. In 1457, Fust published a book of Psalms and made no mention whatsoever of Gutenberg. In 1462, the city of Mainz, Gutenberg's hometown, was sacked, and Gutenberg went into exile. He died in 1468, with his contributions largely unknown. Now, in the aftermath, in the 50 years after Gutenberg, 20 million books were published in Western Europe, more than had been copied by all the scribes in Europe during the previous 1,000 years. By 1600, over 200 million books had been published, an explosion. For the first time, authors like Luther and Erasmus wrote books that sold hundreds of thousands of copies, never happened before. But printing's full impact took much longer to emerge. And for the first 50 years, printed books were simply made more quickly and less expensively than those had been created by scribes. It reminds me a bit of the first 5 or 10 years that newspapers had websites in which they simply took the content from the newspaper and put it on the website. Not a creative act, just assuming the newspaper was the basic text. In the case of Gutenberg's era, the fonts looked just like the scribe's penmanship. They had the same content, 80% of it was in Latin, and it wasn't really until a full century after Gutenberg that something genuinely new appeared. Now, the story would be very different, the story of our culture, if everything had stopped there. Because 50 years after Gutenberg, it looked as if the printing press would secure the old regime, not disrupt it and welcome a new one. It produced the indulgences against which Luther raged and led to the Reformation. It both printed the first Bible and diminished the authority of the Catholic Church. It spread the influence of Latin and led to the rise of the vernacular throughout Europe. It spread the word of God and also enabled the rise of science. So I would argue that journalism and digital culture are at a similar point in development today. These are the very early times in the revolution. If we take 1990, say, as the birth of digital culture, we're around 1481 in Gutenberg's time, long before most of the developments I just listed took place. Some have suggested that we're living on the other side of what they call the Gutenberg parentheses. Outside, to the left of the parentheses, is the pre-1456 oral culture, where information is largely passed around mouth to mouth. Scribes copy books by hand, and in both processes, the contents changes as the stories are either retold or rewritten. Neither process instilled a fixed sense of ownership or authorship. Now, Gutenberg's printing press completely changed our conception of the world, introducing concepts like intellectual property and the editorial advertising business model. We are all educated and socialized within the Gutenberg parentheses. And this is why it has been so difficult for us to accept the fact that the world inside the Gutenberg parentheses wasn't the culture's final resting place, but was only a 500-year pause. That dominance is now being challenged by digital culture and the pre-Gutenberg oral culture that it embraced. The revolution began in the 19th century with the invention of the telegraph, which made information transfer instant and eventually international. In the 1920s, broadcasting made live events accessible to the audience at home and created the notion of a mass media. The internet and the web have made communication two-way and truly global. And today information is passed around link to link, click to click, remixed along the way, more process than product, with more ambiguity about who owns what. Again, going back to this sort of oral scribe culture. With this confusion comes a crisis in the business model. Now, I'm often asked, why is traditional journalism in such bad shape? I'll answer that question with a question. How many thriving industries can you think of that have relied on the same technology and same business model for over a century? From 1945 through 1990, one of the best jobs in American journalism was as an advertising salesman at a large metropolitan daily newspaper. Every day, he'd arrive at his office, pick up the phone, and take orders from department stores and retailers throughout the city. They had nowhere else to go. As long as there was enough editorial copy to publish alongside advertisements, the system worked. News organizations enjoyed higher and higher profits by attracting larger and larger audiences, and by pricing their products artificially low. They didn't discriminate all that much between different kinds of consumers. They just wanted to get as many readers, consumers as possible. As a result, journalism organizations developed stronger relationships with their advertisers than with their readers. Most readers had only a superficial connection to journalism, which they realized wasn't really worth paying for. It existed solely for the sake of the advertisers. Now, in the post-Gutenberg era, there's a post-Gutenberg economics that has to do with more models, more mobile, and more available news. Today, there's no single business for journalism. In an interview with The Economist magazine, Hearst magazine president David Carey said, "You need 5 or 6 revenue streams to make business really successful." And the largest factor spurring journalism innovation has been in hardware. The iPod was invented in 2001, the iPhone, the iPad in 2007, 2010, and I would argue that these hardware disruptions, along with all the obvious other ones, Google, Nexus phone, things like that, have been the biggest factor in transforming journalism. Now, Condé Nast, the magazine empire, was one of the earliest tablet experimenters in the publishing world, and it found some very interesting things when it started seriously working on its digital. It found that users spent upwards of 60 minutes with its mobile application, suggesting that experience is like reading a magazine with the very deep engagement that implies. The Pew Research Center found that 73% of adults who consume news on their tablet read in-depth articles, with 19% doing so daily. 68% of tablet owners read newspapers or magazines on a tablet that they would never have read in print. 45% of magazine readers who own tablets spend 1 to 3 hours a week with magazines, and another 18% spend 3 to 5 hours. So regardless of the platform, 4 business models have emerged as the primary ways for magazines to generate profit. Selling advertising, the traditional one, selling subscriptions, which was very much diminished in the older model, having conferences and events, sometimes known as the busking model, and selling applications, the software that lets you read their publication. So let me just give you a few case studies where I see not, perfection, but some innovation that I find suggestive. The Atlantic Monthly magazine, one of the oldest magazines in the United States, founded in 1857. It's always an important journal of opinion, and it's always lost money. In 2005, the new owner realized that the only way to save the old magazine was to create a new one. So he made access to the website free, and the website expanded tremendously. It created an entirely new digital magazine and broke down the wall between print and online. It continued to run long, thoughtful, pieces and hired a bunch of smart political and cultural writers to write exclusively for the website. In 2014, the Atlantic's digital ad revenue exceeded its print revenue, and digital ad sales now make up 60% of the total. So the way it confronted the demise of the magazine was sort of counterintuitive. It created another magazine. It didn't simply try to move the contents of one magazine online. Another magazine that you don't associate with innovation is National Geographic. Yet it was always trying to do new things. It was one of the first magazines to experiment with color photography. And they too created several new magazines to deal with the problem of the existing print magazine. National Geographic now produces 4 digital magazines, as well as 20 free and paid apps for the iPad and other devices, and 13 for the iPhone. It's focused on the interaction in their tablets, adds video, audio, interactive maps, things like that, not simply passive taking in of information. And the magazine's English language app reached 4.5 million downloads and has 300,000 paid digital subscribers. To get readers to visit the monthly app more regularly, it began offering daily coverage in 2012 with news feeds and photos of the day feature. Subscribers even received live coverage of a recent Mount Everest expedition with Twitter feeds, photos, videos, and blog posts from the team members. So it put tremendous amount of resources into making it interactive and developing a whole new group of readers. Another example is a corporation, it's a corporate effort. It's called Fusion, which is only about a year old. And this is reacting much more to a more demographic shift in the United States, which is not just about age, but also about ethnicity. You know, as I'm sure you're well aware, the largest growing ethnic group in the United States is Spanish-speaking people from all over the world. And with that has come a second demographic phenomenon, which is their children, who are neither wholly Spanish speakers nor wholly English speakers, or maybe more wholly English speakers than Spanish speakers. It's a very different demographic, a different kind of public. So Fusion was originally conceived to attract primarily a younger audience of English-speaking Hispanic and Latino Americans. About 20% of millennials, of people born after 2000, are classified as being of Latino descent. It's a lot of people. So Fusion broadened its scope, though, to engage and champion a young, diverse, and inclusive America, regardless of cultural or language background, but taking the Spanish-speaking second generation as sort of its core. It's an American multi-platform media that's a joint venture between ABC and Disney, and also Univision Communications. So it's this, massive corporate effort, but trying to do something very experimental. It was launched in 2013, and the network's content now features news, lifestyle, pop culture, satire, and entertainment aimed at English-speaking millennials, including those of Hispanic background. The channel is Univision's first major push into English language programming. And Fusion gears its programming less towards breaking news, instead emphasizing context and analysis of news and issues, along with interviews, documentaries, and long-form reports on current events, lifestyle, and pop culture. And if that sounds diffuse and general, it is. Fusion is an ongoing experiment of how best to address this group of people. And they find that one of the first things to do is to throw out the notion of specific forms as being the way, print, digital, video, and really trying a whole bunch of these different kind of things. Going back to something more traditional, in books, by 2013, ebooks represented 25% of the U.S. trade publishing market, up 45% since 2011. And audiobook sales also now are up 11%, another digital form. So even newspapers are changing the business model. In 2014, for the first time ever, newspapers around the world generated more revenue from circulation than from advertising. $92 billion from circulation compared to $87 billion for advertising. Quote, the basic assumption of the news business model that advertisers would subsidize news is gone, said Larry Kilman, Secretary General of the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. Quote, this is a seismic shift from a relationship between publishers and advertisers to publishers and their audience. Some European and Asian papers have been 50-50 for years. In the U.S., despite the strong growth of digital subscriptions and advertising, print still provides 93% of the revenues, so the United States is far behind. India, Latin America, and the Middle East and Africa have experienced great growth, and circulation is down in North America, Europe, and Australia. The desktop audience, people reading newspapers on their computers, fell for the first time as mobile use continued to surge. So, what do we conclude from all these disparate developments? One is that it takes time for a new medium to mature. The newspapers of the 1700s simply made things up or relied on, so-called letters from far-flung, unpaid correspondence. And professional journalism didn't really come along for another 100 years. Radio began as a hobbyist's novelty until it became a vehicle for news and variety shows. The gramophone was originally designed for office dictation. Television was originally intended simply to bring pictures of live events into people's homes. So I think we see how all of these developments come onto the stage, and it takes us a while to figure out what they really mean and what their real uses and what their really beneficial uses are. And uncomfortably enough, we're in the middle of that process. So one of the things I think that we conclude is that free content, which has been the bane of existence to so many publishers, has to play a role in whatever happens in the future. You have 30 hours of video material uploaded to YouTube every minute, and journalists have to use their skills as curators to curate the vast pool of material developed by people and organizations outside of the conventional media mainstream, which is good news in some ways, because traditional journalists are trained to be curators. That's what we do, and we are the best ones to do that sort of thing. And I think that turning our attention to free content in that spirit is an important development. The other thing we have to do is, as my 12-year-old son says, get over ourselves. We have to make these changes by listening to young people. The example I use sometimes is of children born to immigrant parents. They still learn their native language from their parents, but in an immigrant family, the roles are reversed, and the children become the translators to the parents. And in many respects, it's the parent who must be taught the new vocabulary, and the degree of parental discomfort is proportional to the degree of dependence on the child's translating ability. In situations where the parent is helpless without the child's mediation, the level of discomfort is very high. And I think that's what we're experiencing. This is a very high level of discomfort, and it's created a lot of anxiety, anger, resentment towards younger people because of this anxiety. Now, I think the new best example of what's generated by this new dynamic is in podcasts. And I don't know how widespread podcasting is in Spain. In the United States, it's become this literary journalism revolution, really. Some of the best work is being done in literary journalism is being done in podcasts, being done in audio. And the interesting thing is some of the best work being done in podcasts is coming from people who come from outside of journalism, particularly from musicians. Pro Tools, one of the most popular editing software suites, is primarily used in the music world. So musicians who have an interest in journalism or interest in various subjects have the technological skills and sophistication to do some of the mixing. And I've met dozens of young, hungry journalists who were trained as musicians and are now having to learn journalism techniques. Now, there's incredible growth in podcasts as opposed to radio, where it's fairly flat. There really is not a lot of growth. Podcasts are highly produced, deeply reported, well-written, long-form pieces. I sometimes think of them as sort of nonfiction radio plays or something like that. 44% of Americans now listen to podcasts on a weekly basis. Podcast consumption has grown from roughly 39 million users in 2014 to 46 million in 2015. There was a sensation last year called Serial. It was a long-form podcast that investigated a decades-old murder week by week in real time, following the reporter and her team. Over 80 million people downloaded it. So this was not the event that will change the form as much as it was an event that was sort of typical of the kinds of things that I think are coming. The national advertising market for podcasts is still relatively small, between 50 and 100 million, but it's growing very fast. Last year, Apple said that subscriptions of podcasts through its iTunes device or software reached 1 billion. Technological innovation is the key development. Now, despite the early enthusiasm of podcasts in the early 2000s, it faded in popularity really because there were so many steps required to download them. You had to go to a website, click it, find a player, have it play on your computer. When iPhones, iPads, and other devices came around, it was so much easier to use them, and the moment it was easier to use them, interest soared again. The introduction of the iPhone in particular in 2007 made podcasts convenient to access. It's easier to play them in cars now too, as automakers build wireless media functions into more and more models, and faster Wi-Fi and mobile data speeds have made podcasts easier to stream. So to me, podcasts, when people, and I asked to speak about sort of developments in literary journalism, I really turn to and play often podcasts. I think that's the best example of long-form journalism that's really infused with the very best of traditional values of journalism: in-depth reporting, beautiful writing, thoughtful, creative. So I'm not suggesting that the podcast economy will take care of big media's economy, but I do think that there are indications that, driven by the advertising content model, we have overemphasized the importance of the size of the audience. These podcasts have relatively small audiences by television standards or movie standards, but they're very passionate audiences. And right now, a passionate audience is measured in the same way that a passive audience is. If I listen to a show and I'm listening with every bit of my being, or I just turn a show and let it play in the background, we're measured in exactly the same way. That's a technological problem. Online, a click is a click is a click. But studies have shown that small numbers of dedicated readers generate the greatest number of page views. They visit sites they love most frequently, they look at more pages when they visit, and they spend more time on any given site. They are the long readers, they are the in-depth, passionate readers, and need to be counted in that way. In the future, we must not only measure them differently, but design everything about their media experiences differently. Short, disengaged readers will always be important and need to get their basic news as efficiently as possible, and they'll pay for that privilege. Long, engaged readers, passionate readers, must be made as comfortable as possible so that they might luxuriate in the journalism that they love, and they too will pay for that privilege. The success of Bloomberg News is one of the great examples of the pay model for short, disengaged, or short, immediate financial news. People pay a fortune because they need it. Engagement, not numbers, will become the most important characteristic. The more engaged readers are, the more chance we have of making money from them, whether through advertisements or a variety of other transactions, live shows, whatever it is. The benefit of more engagement isn't just a higher ad rate, but it's in the relationship that a publisher must build with their most loyal readers. And that's a dynamic that's been lost in the drive to attract a mass media. I'm confident that traditional values of journalism will be more properly valued in the new economic models that emerge in the post-Gutenberg (era), And we must stay true to our traditions, even as we stay open to experiments and to new ways of thinking. Thank you very much. So I'll take questions, I guess.
Tenim ara un temps per preguntes. Hi ha algú que vulgui trencar el gel?
Buenos días, Robert. Una de las preguntas básicas que yo creo que en este momento nos interesa, sobre todo a los que somos periodistas de prensa escrita, es el modelo de negocio. Creemos que los lectores más mayores siguen leyendo en papel, todavía no se han pasado a las nuevas tecnologías, y en cambio los jóvenes aún no pagan por leer. ¿Usted qué piensa sobre el tema?
Well, I often imagine a past where the people who went on to create Google and Facebook and Apple and the people who went on to be the business managers and newspapers switched places. Can you imagine where we would be today in the media if the businessmen who ran one were the others? But alas, that didn't take place. I'm not one of these people who believes that print will go away. As you say, it's not. There's plenty of people, in this case, older people. My son, who's 12, can't stand reading ebooks. He loves reading books. There will always be people who want that, and not just for age reasons. Some content is better in books or in print than it is online or on an e-reader. So I think that anyone who thinks that, makes pronouncements that one form will wipe out another form is, again, like the cliche of the person who said that television would destroy radio or movies would be destroyed by sound or, these kinds of things. They're sort of silly. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the greater problem is the second part of your insight, which is that a whole generation has been raised not to pay anything for content. And that was a tremendous mistake that I think it's fair to say pretty much every major media organization is trying to walk back very slowly and correct very slowly. I don't know enough about this Spanish media to know about whether there's been attempts to charge for digital media access, and if so, if they've been successful or not. In the United States, they've been somewhat successful in a few cases. Elite media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, some places like that. Certainly not successful in the sense that they'll ever gain as much revenue from digital subscriptions than they did from other subscriptions, and that certainly the advertising revenue online will never approach, or at least in the foreseeable future, will never approach the other medium advertising revenue. But I do think that the attentiveness to the way that different readers want to read is the key to any success in the future of any kind of publication. So I know that the communities are very responsive and when they feel they're being spoken to. There was an example in the New York Times about a month ago. There was a big article about nail salons in New York, generally run by Koreans, generally staffed by Chinese and various Hispanic people, and the terrible, terrible work conditions that existed there. And the New York Times published the article in English, Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. And it was several days. It was a big, long article. Must have been a very big task translating and stuff. And the reaction was enormous. Now I can't quantify the reaction in each of those communities. But my wife is Korean American. My in-laws are Korean. They read it. I've never had them talk to me about an article in the New York Times before. And I don't know whether that translates into subscribers to the New York Times from Korea and other places, but the New York Times has been translating it every day into Chinese for years now. There's a Chinese language edition. I think the more those kinds of things are done, that's just in the United States with so many ethnic groups, but I could easily see, I've been writing a book about Japan and North Korea for the past 6 years. I've spent a lot of time in Japan. Japan has incredible circulation. I mean, their newspapers have 10 million circulation or so. I mean, there are odd reasons behind that, but Japan also has one of the most rapidly aging groups in the world. And one thing they've done is they've tailored a lot of their subscriptions to their demographics. So they cater to older people in various ways, making certain offers and solicitations. So, it seems to me that if you have a paper product that's valued highly by older people, you take that as a starting point. You don't try to convert them to digital readers. You start thinking, well, what are the other needs that older readers have that are passionate about this? What else will they perhaps pay for? That's not I'm sure other people have thought of that. It's not a new insight, but I think that this idea where there is one business model, everyone has to either read it digitally or on paper or in some other way, that to me is this sort of Gutenberg parentheses thinking, that there is a set way to do everything, a set way to print, a set way to generate revenue. As I quoted from that executive at Condé Nast, you need to have 5 or 6 different revenue models. It's a more complicated business. Things don't scale as easily. And one of the things that's so interesting to me about these podcasts is that, some of them are just a guy sitting in his underwear in his apartment with a laptop, and he doesn't need a lot to sustain himself. But it allows for all sorts of creativity on a smaller scale. He's counting on a smaller, very passionate audience and a few advertisers, not tons of people. And I think that's the kind of thinking that I'm not a businessman. That's the kind of thinking I can grasp because I think I understand creativity when it comes to nonfiction, to journalism, and it seems to me that those experiments are having some early success. But, if I'm the head of Condé Nast or the Times Corporation or, La Vanguardia or something like that, it doesn't answer my problem. That doesn't serve my needs, but, those aren't my problems and my needs.
Més preguntes?
I'm sure there's some arguments because I'm full of optimism and opinions, and I can't imagine that people take them all seriously. So please.
Hi, Robert. Very good to have you here. Just one short question. I don't know if I got it right. You said in 2014 the circulation revenues overtook the advertisement revenue.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
You were talking about written press or online subscriptions or?
That was, as far as I know from those numbers, it literally came out last week as I was writing this. I think it's circulation, digital and otherwise. I think the point was just that people have evidenced their willingness to pay and that is generating actually more revenue than advertising. And anyone who's been in this business, even for 20 years, if you had told, the smart head of advertising or the publisher of the most important newspapers 20 years ago, you're going to make most of your money or even a substantial portion of your money from the readers, not the advertisers, they would have told you were out of your mind. It was literally unthinkable. That's the problem. And I think that if that can change, takes 20 years, maybe longer, I think all sorts of other things can change. But I just feel that's it's a healthier way to think about media. There was something corrupting about the alliance that journalism made with its advertisers. I'm not saying it was bad, but it was corrupting. It led to laziness. I mean, I don't know enough about Spanish media, but do you know the profit margin for newspapers, like even mid-sized, not very good newspapers? They were 20%, huge profits. These guys were sitting pretty for years. It was like the music industry. The profits were so crazily high, there was no incentive to change. They just tried to keep the machine going as long as possible, because the alternative was to put themselves out of business effectively. And they essentially destroyed the business little by little, and now other people are having to figure out how to do it differently. Me too. Email me. I'll send you the link to it, because it was. I was very surprised as well. And it's global. I think also I didn't get to look at the report deeply. I would bet that a lot of that revenue comes from developing countries, where economies are picking up. Look, old Europe, old America, the old world, demographics are not on our side, and we're seeing the things that happen when you have fewer people being produced. That's just the way it is. When you have countries where they are, I mean, my God, India, Jesus, there's like a new newspaper every day in India. There's no crisis of journalism there. It's a thriving market. Yeah.
Good morning. I was wondering, like, you as a teacher and you having students, if that students they get the chance to get a job in the United States of America, and if they do, if they achieve to give new ideas to the media, because and relating to what he asked, there is this big break in Spain. Sorry for my English, not perfect. Where newspapers and digital newspaper are just the same. So digital newspaper are just taking the news from the paper and put it right away
shovelware, it's called.
So this is not the way to do new journalism. And I'm talking, well, we were just chatting before that youth people here has no chance to get a proper job in journalism, even though we've got a lot of ideas to improve this age break, And I just wanted to know how young people do it in the United States, and if you recommend us, what's the way to to give our ideas we have here.
Well, I think the example you gave, the phrase in English is shovelware. You shovel the contents from the newspaper, you put it online. That was sort of the first phase of kind of digital news culture, and it was, the comparison I was trying to draw was when you'd use Gutenberg's movable type and you'd make it look like a scribe had written it, right? So the idea was, we'll just do what scribes do faster. And that's sort of the thinking, I think, behind this first thing. So the next stage, I think, is really the wisdom of these publications. There's a fashionable term I can't stand in business management called, creative destruction. They take from Schumpeter, this idea that you could create destruction within so that you don't get destroyed from without. So, every big newspaper empire here should be creating divisions where they hire nothing but young people and say, here's a small amount of money, experiment, see what you can do, and we'll get behind you in a business and technological way. These little labs, and 90% will fail, but 10% will succeed, or something like that. I mean, that's what, in Chile they've done this. A lot of these newspapers in Chile, a much smaller population, they've created a lot of these, El Mercurio has created all these little sort of micro-sites within the El Mercurio infrastructure, hoping to, bring students in and women in and fashionistas in, and then move them around and digitally, and then also keep the newspaper. That's the one publication I'm familiar with from personal connections. But I think that that kind of experimentation, it's an issue of capital probably, but it's also an issue of just sort of self-confidence, really. I know that in Japan, bizarrely enough, there's the similar situation. In that most of the online news is simply a duplicate or grows out of the enormous print publications. There's not a lot of, for all sorts of cultural reasons, confidence, innovation in that realm. And I think that, it really takes young people feeling that they need to, they can experiment like that. So in the United States, my students, the program I run is particularly geared towards students who want to write books and long-form nonfiction, long articles, things like that. So the understanding I have with not all, but most of my students is you come in with an idea. You have to apply with an idea, and we'll help you develop the idea, teach you how to report creatively, do research creatively, write creatively, and then get you to a point where you can write a book proposal, a sample chapter perhaps, and perhaps get a book contract. And then we've had six of our students get book contracts from that. That's one goal. It's not a business model, but it's a life, and it's it's a project that I can understand the parts of. Can't duplicate it with everybody. Not everyone's going to work for everyone, but I feel like that kind of thinking in some ways has led to some of the best web publications too. There's a website called Jezebel, which is part of the Gawker Media thing. And it really came out of this one woman, Anna Holmes, and her frustration with sort of with old style feminism, and also with sort of younger, silly, what she felt were sort of silly developments in feminism. And she wanted to develop basically what Gloria Steinem did with Ms., but she wanted to do it for women of her generation. And it was it is very successful within that world. So, I feel like, I always feel so so culturally conservative in that I'm always suggesting things that I feel have been around forever, sort of take the issues that you and your friends care about. I don't mean care about in a sort of superficial, we're for this movement and that movement, but like really care about, whether it's about sexuality or about, sports or gambling or, whatever it is, and go after that, and then find other people who are passionate about that. There's this a test I always encourage my students to run, which I call the gossip test. And the gossip test is, what is it you talk about when you're not trying to impress somebody, you're not trying to impress a teacher or a lover or a parent or something, the place your mind goes to that just feels like a warm bath, a warm intellectual bath, the things you love thinking about, that's what you should be writing about. Not exclusively, not all the time, but that is your sort of lodestar, your journalistic lodestar. Can you turn those things into something publishable that's going to be journalism? And I find that that's a very, it's a moment of freedom when someone realizes, oh my God, that's something I can write about? Yeah, you can write about that. You can create interesting journalism about that. In fact, that's really all you should be creating interesting journalism about. We don't need people, standing up and, pretending to be war correspondents or using official voices and stuff like that. That's an older model that is that works to the extent it works. But if you're asking how do people with no experience and young people, all you've got, look, you've got universal health insurance. You got one thing, in advance. You don't have mortgages. You don't have kids, and you can work a lot harder than people my age can. And you've got these passions. And if you can disentangle the passions from the fake passions, the gestural politics and things like that, then you've got something that really is a genuine subject matter.
I wonder if we are talking about journalism and business and things like that. Just what do you think about the Huffington Post model?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Huffington Post in doing
Huffington Post. Oh, yeah. The Huffington Post is it's a different model. It's much more a model of voices. It's the publication, The Village Voice, in New York was one of the first alternative newspapers, not the first, but one of the first. And it was literally that. It was the idea of a group of people to which it was giving a voice. And the way you broke into the Village Voice, it's founded in 1954, was you'd write a letter to the editor. And you'd write, passionate letter, I hate this. And if they liked it, they would publish it, and they'd ask you to write more, and then you'd become a writer for them, So it was also against the idea of professional journalism as it had become known. It was trying to, break out of that. And I see the Huffington Post as sort of similar to that. It started off as, Arianna Huffington and her pals who would write columns, none of which they'd be paid for. And then when it got purchased by AOL, it became something slightly different, in international editions and stuff like that. Now that AOL has been purchased, I have no idea what's going to come of Huffington Post. But I think that's another model. But again, what is the Huffington Post? It's curated. There's a sensibility of some sort behind it. That's a very old virtue, right? The great magazines in the United States, anyway, the 60s and 70s, Esquire, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, were a sensibility, an editor who had a view of the world and brought in voices who could articulate that. And I think the Huffington Post had that. The more it's become a general publication with a Paris correspondent and that stuff, it's tried to make itself bigger and scale differently. But it's another model, It's something that works. But I think, it's none of these models works forever. It's not like, again, this is when you're outside of the Gutenberg parentheses, that it might work for 3 or 4 years, and then something else may work. And I think it's sort of exhausting for that reason.
Preguntas?
Yes, hello. You talk about radio just briefly, and I just want to ask you, what's going to be the future of radio journalism? If we talk about radio and podcasting, in what extent in the future the journalists who are good at radio journalism will have a place doing podcasting?
Mm-hmm. I think of the phenomenon of radio news, BBC or something like that, and podcasting, which is sort of like the kind of documentaries almost of a BBC, as really being two very different animals. And I'd just be blowing smoke if I talked about radio news. I have no idea how well or poorly its future is. I do think that audio documentaries of the sort that the BBC does, or these more heavily produced, I think more aesthetically sort of inclined podcasts, have a future for the reasons I explained: passionate audiences, a sensibility. Most of these, some of them are generalist, but most of them are fairly specific. I have a website. Who doesn't? I have a million websites actually, but I have one website that I started with my students called podforum.org, podforum.org, which is a intelligent search engine for podcasts. So we post 3 or 2 a day, although we're on hiatus right now. And then on the left-hand side are links to all the podcasts that exemplify this well-produced thing. And I think that there's a real growth there, and they're already, we're seeing that kind of growth. I don't know about the crossover between, live radio news reports. I do think that audio skills and the world of audio itself is more and more relevant to the news business. That with live streaming, universal connectivity, Wi-Fi, bandwidth increasing, that, there's no reason why. I see people here talking in the subway all day long on their phones, and there's a reason they couldn't be listening to great radio all day long through their phones. And, those apps are being developed. It's it's funny to think how new this stuff is, really. What is this, 2015? I mean, I remember I was here, last time I was in Barcelona, well, actually I was here about 5-6 years ago, but the first time my wife and I came was 2000, or maybe 1999. And we were thinking back on how different, not just Barcelona was, but how different our knowledge of Barcelona. There's no internet. You know, I didn't find a hotel that way. I didn't know where to go. You know, this stuff is still pretty damn new. And I think figuring out how to use it is something that we're really tasked with. Right now in podcasting, the thing that I think needs to be solved is the ability to share, right? So social media allows you to share things like articles easily, whether through Facebook or Twitter, whatever you want. Podcasts, you can share whole podcasts. What if you just want to share a minute or 30 seconds of a podcast? That's a real need and desire for listeners whenever there are surveys of podcasters. That's going to be solved. Someone's going to come up with a way to clip a little bit and do it easily. And that's going to be monetizable, right? You can put an ad on that, or you can charge a tiny micropayment, or well, I don't know what it's going to be. But, you know, and we could sit here and probably, you and I, come up with half a dozen other immediate things that need to be solved. Not, you know, the business model, but micro things. I'm in this place and want to read this sort of thing. How do I get that? And I think that we're still in such early days that I know that I think it's exciting. I mean, look, it's hell to be, if you are 50, 52 in my case, and on the staff of a national newspaper whose revenues are declining and everything, it ain't good news. You know, this is not a happy time. That's the way change works. I think there are ways to manage the decline, but, you know, when I say to my students are 23, 24, 25, 26, they have no attachment to the old media model. Because of me, they venerate it, and they read the great stuff, and they think about the great models and some of the editors who have been important, and the writers who have been, and techniques that have been important. But, you know, the demise of the old media model is not really their thing. They're looking, you know, like these young women are looking at thinking about things like that. So it's very exciting, I think, for a certain kind of person. But, you know, there's always going to be sort of tragedy and also optimism are always, you know, going to come together.
Well, thank you very much for your input. And I don't know if it's a question, but I would like you to talk a little bit about the worker's point of view. Let's say from the producer, I observe that content is getting bigger in online magazines. The model that I observe that it's growing better is New York Times model, and you see their page, you have a lot of, well, the content is, stories are getting bigger, like it's a magazine more than a newspaper sometimes.
Good point.
And I would like to know how it's, how are the industry, at least in US, dealing with that, because in one hand, I think there is a need yet for people working lots of hours, making content and producing like this mobile types information and tweet information and everything. And in the other hand, as intellectuals that journalists are, to produce big content or even to do what you were telling her to do, you need time and you need to live.
Right.
So I'd like to know a little bit, how do you analyze this situation, this...
You know, it's funny, whenever I tell people how much I love Spain, and they say, really, where have you been? I say, well, I've been to Barcelona. And they say, you haven't been to Spain. You know, in the same way that when you come to New York, you haven't been in the United States. When you point to the New York Times, you're not really pointing to the entire American journalism industry. And most newspapers they're screwed, you know. I mean, the days when you had 2 or 3 or even 4 newspapers in one town or city are gone. If you have one, you're lucky. So, I mean, you know, not to underestimate the amount of tragedy that has entailed, nor to underestimate the difficulty of doing, as you say, how do you hold things together? as a young person in the media, and I don't think there's any there's no be all, there's no one fix about that. I don't think that, I don't know how to say this exactly without sounding too elitist, but I'm not sure that, I think one of the other assumptions within the Gutenberg parentheses has been that there is this thing called the media business, which can be commodified and have stocks and dividends and things like every other business. And I'm not sure that's true, except for a very small group of elite media. I don't fear for the future of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or La Vanguardia or the Times of London and, certain elite papers. I think they'll always be here. What they'll look like is a question. But I do wonder about whether the existence of, say, 3 papers in Milwaukee, was a historical accident. You had post-war, First World War, and then Second World War explosion of wealth in the United States. You had incredibly high advertising revenues. You had very little competition from television, radio, certainly the internet. It was sort of this little moment, maybe the exception, not the rule, where you could have a rational business, heads, and you bring in new people every year and stuff like that, like a business, Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe maybe news just doesn't work that way, with a few exceptions, There isn't really there hasn't been a career path in newspaper journalism in 20 years. The conventional wisdom was always you go and work at a small newspaper and then a bigger one at a bigger town, and then you get to a big city, and then you go. That hasn't held true for as long as I've been in the industry. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know. But I don't think that relying on some version of the older structure is possible anymore. And I'm not a business person, but I do think that these other smaller structures. One hopeful thing, I was talking to someone about this just before, was among these podcasts, a number of them have formed a association. It's called Radiotopia, and it's, I think, 8 or 10 podcasts which share resources, share all sorts of administrative costs and things, and are becoming like a small nonprofit, company. It's happened in photography with Magnum and other organizations, these co-ops. There are writing co-ops. There are some music co-ops. That's an interesting model. You get a few like-minded people with some success who can add to each other and defray some of the business costs. I think those are very suggestive. I don't think they scale and become huge, but I think those are the kinds of things that, rather than trying to insert myself into the large old model of media, I would be trying to do that sort of thing, or starting the kind of publication I was describing or encouraging there. Yeah. Look, but in the end, but again, it is this idea that I think the great benefit of the new journalism, or however you define it, was it unlocked a kind of freedom and creativity, or the possibility of freedom and creativity among writers, And I think that similar things here, yes, you don't have, I wasn't joking about the healthcare. Look, countries that have universal healthcare have a huge advantage for creative people. When I was a freelancer for 10 years, I was paying $250 a month for my healthcare for a healthy 20-something-year-old. That was crippling. And the freedom of being told to go and pursue these sort of passionate things are dynamics we associate more with music bands and other sort of things, other kinds of creative projects, painters, sculptors, And I think that kind of thinking is a little more akin to what media will be like in the future, with big media conglomerates and elite media. But I think that's there's less and less of a need for ordinary people in that, and more of a need in the other.
Temps per una pregunta curta i...
A quick one. You were talking about free contents, that, if I got it right, now with the internet we have to provide free contents in some way.
Well, I think that the reality of user-generated content is there, and that it seemed to me that one way that old media can embrace or work with new media is to take seriously the curation skills of old media and use that to curate new media. So, to take, look, if you have 30 hours of new content on YouTube, now we both know that most of it is crap, right? But there's going to be, 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 5 seconds of something in there that is an interesting artifact that can be done something, and that seems to me a legitimate task for the old media. I think old media is stuck in the idea, or was stuck in the idea, that it had to generate everything itself. Everything had to come from in-house. And I think that's just not sustainable anymore. And the bad way we've seen it is where you have freelance everything, or I've heard business model here, you've, freelance photographers who have to stay at the newspaper and only work for them. That's the worst of all worlds, right? But the benefit is that when you have all this other media around to aggregate. I mean, if you don't aggregate, you're sort of foolish, because there's a lot of good stuff out there, and it makes sense. I mean, the Guardian does this very well in England. They have a lot of aggregated stuff as well as fantastic new content. And they sort of understand that their role is to work with both of those things.
The question was where the limit is.
That's the question. I think that any time that you think you can get by with just free content, that's always the, I've seen enough of these, businessmen who just, the glimmer in their eye, they're thinking, wait a second, free content, oh, that's great. Well, that's ridiculous. Anyone who's working, but I think that the creative pairing of really good original reporting, writing, whatever it is, and free content, there's something to that, and I think it's just foolish to ignore this vast world. I mean, the internet has freed up, we're all writers. Everyone's a writer. And podcasting, although the technological barrier is slightly higher, because editing is actually difficult, there are hundreds of podcasts. I mean, remember when everyone had a blog, a few of them actually ended up becoming interesting writers, so I feel that it'd be silly to ignore that as a way to, I always say that to my students, it's never been easier to get published, but never been harder to get heard or read. And they're both true. There are a lot more publications now than when I started writing, and the pay is an issue, and all these things are issues. Look, writers never been paid that well. It's not like, I can pull a lot of news, letters from all the great, Joan Didion and all the great writers bitching about how they're being underpaid. That's always been the case, although it was less the case, at a certain point. But
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Robert. It has been a pleasure. We are grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us today. Moltes gràcies a tothom. Acabarem aquest acte, com ja hem dit abans, dintre de 5 minuts hi haurà l'acte de presentació del llibre El nuevo periodismo. Moltes gràcies a tots plegats, al Servei de Publicacions de la Universitat de Barcelona, al Roberto i al Robert. Gràcies.
Gràcies.